One empire, one decision, millions erased, the Armenian deportations, bureaucracy of annihilation. A story where paperwork became a weapon, where systems turned into silence. What happens when genocide gets organized? Subscribe for untold histories that change everything. In the spring of 1915, the Ottoman Empire transformed organized slaughter into administrative procedure. What began as whispered security concerns in Constantinople would become one of history's most systematic mass atrocities, distinguished by a chilling feature. It was conducted not through frenzied violence alone, but through the cold machinery of bureaucratic decree. On the 24th of April, approximately 250 Armenian intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders were arrested in Constantinople. Most would be executed. This was no spontaneous outbreak. It was the opening move of a calculated campaign orchestrated by Minister of War Enver Pasha and sanctioned through official channels. Just 3 weeks later, on the 14th of May, the Ottoman government enacted the law on deportation by sultanic decree, legalizing forced displacement under military authority. The timing was deliberate. The Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War on the side of the Central Powers the previous October. In January, Armenian soldiers were systematically disarmed and transferred to labor battalions where many were killed. The Armenian resistance during the Battle of Van in April provided the pretext authorities needed. What followed was the deportation of over 1 million Armenians into the Syrian desert. Orders were stamped, files were organized, quotas were established. Most deportees never arrived at their destinations alive. This is the story of how modern bureaucracy became an instrument of annihilation and how the machinery of state transformed genocide into paperwork. The foundations of catastrophe are rarely built in darkness. They are constructed in offices, ratified in meetings, and distributed as memoranda. In the Ottoman Empire of 1914 and 1915, the machinery of destruction took on the appearance of legitimate governance, cloaked in the language of military necessity and wrapped in the bureaucratic procedures that made ordinary men complicit in extraordinary crimes. To understand how a nation could systematically deport and destroy a population of over 1 million people, one must first examine the circumstances that created the conditions for such an act. The Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century was a state in profound crisis. Once the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, the empire had contracted dramatically across the previous century. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had stripped away significant European territories. Military defeats had become routine. The empire's treasury was depleted, its military exhausted, and its political leadership fragmented between those who clung to the old order and those who sought radical transformation. When the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the 29th of October 1914, by aligning with the Central Powers, it did so from a position of desperation rather than strength. The empire needed this war to restore its prestige, to reclaim lost territories, and to reassert its authority over its fractious internal populations. The military leadership, particularly Minister of War Enver Pasha, viewed the war as an opportunity, but they also viewed it as a moment of existential vulnerability, a time when the state's grip on its diverse population could slip away entirely. The Armenians of the Ottoman Empire had lived within its borders for centuries. They were a Christian minority in a predominantly Muslim state, and their status had always been precarious. Legally, they occupied the position of dhimmis, a protected but subordinate community. In practice, their experience varied dramatically by region and by the disposition of local authorities. Some Armenian communities prospered as merchants and artisans. Others endured periodic violence and systematic discrimination. What united them was their awareness that their existence depended upon the empire's continued tolerance, and that tolerance was never guaranteed. By 1915, the Ottoman leadership had begun to view Armenian nationalism with acute suspicion. The empire's Armenian population had indeed developed nationalist aspirations, particularly among younger, educated Armenians who looked toward the possibility of Armenian autonomy or independence. Some Armenian revolutionary organizations operated within Ottoman territory. To the Ottoman government, these were not merely nationalist movements, but existential threats, particularly during wartime when the state claimed total authority and demanded total loyalty. The first formal action came in January of 1915. The Ottoman military began systematically disarming Armenian soldiers who were serving in the Ottoman army. These men were transferred from combat units into labor battalions, ostensibly to serve as support troops. Many of these labor battalions were later transferred to remote locations where they were executed or left to die of starvation and exposure. This was not yet the mass deportation that would follow, but it was a significant indicator of what was to come. The Armenian soldiers represented a potential internal threat, and the Ottoman military removed that threat through calculated elimination. the situation escalated dramatically in April of 1915. On the 24th of April, the Ottoman authorities arrested approximately 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople, the empire's capital. These were not military figures or known revolutionaries. They were writers, teachers, priests, politicians, and businessmen. They represented the cultural and intellectual heart of Ottoman Armenian society. Most of those arrested were subsequently executed. The arrests sent a clear message. Armenian leadership would not be tolerated, and the state would eliminate those who might organize or articulate Armenian interests. Simultaneously, military events on the Eastern Front created the context that Ottoman authorities would use to justify far more drastic measures. In April of 1915, Armenian residents of the city of Van resisted Ottoman military operations. The Battle of Van lasted from the 20th of April through the 16th of May, and during this period, approximately 24,000 Armenians in villages surrounding Van were killed over the course of just 3 days. The Ottoman authorities cited this resistance, however limited and desperate, as evidence of widespread Armenian disloyalty and as justification for treating all Armenians as potential enemies of the state. This was the crucial moment of transformation. The Ottoman government moved from targeting specific individuals or responding to specific incidents to developing a comprehensive policy. On the 14th of May 1915, the Ottoman government enacted the law on deportation through a decree issued by the Sultan. This law provided the legal framework for what would follow. It authorized the military, under the authority of the Minister of War, to forcibly relocate populations deemed to be security threats. The law created the appearance of legitimacy. It transformed mass deportation from an act of violence into an administrative procedure, from massacre into military regulation. The language of the deportation law was deliberately vague. It did not specifically name Armenians, though everyone understood whom it targeted. It spoke of security concerns, of the need to move populations away from combat zones, of military necessity in wartime. This vagueness served a purpose. It allowed officials to implement the law with different degrees of severity in different regions. It allowed those who administered the law to claim they were simply following orders, implementing policy, doing their duty as soldiers and bureaucrats. It created a distance between the decision to deport and the violence that accompanied deportation. In May and June of 1915, as the deportation law went into effect, the Ottoman military and administrative apparatus began implementing mass deportations across the empire. Armenians were ordered to abandon their homes and properties and to join deportation convoys headed toward the Syrian desert. These were not organized military evacuations with supply lines and medical support. They were forced marches into inhospitable terrain designed to be lethal. The Ottoman authorities knew that many would not survive the journey. The death toll along the deportation routes would eventually exceed the number who died in direct massacres. Yet the state could claim that deportation was a legitimate military measure, not genocide. The machinery had been set in motion, the bureaucratic structure was in place, the legal framework existed, the military units were mobilized. What had begun as whispered suspicions and targeted arrests had transformed into systematic policy. By mid-1915, the Ottoman Empire had created a state apparatus dedicated to the elimination of its Armenian population, disguised as military necessity and administrative procedure. The stage was set for the catastrophe that would unfold across 1915 and 1916, claiming somewhere between 664,000 and 1.5 million lives. The spring of 1915 arrived in Constantinople with the weight of military necessity pressing upon every official decision. The Ottoman Empire, having entered the Great War on the side of the Central Powers in October of 1914, now found itself engaged in a conflict that demanded absolute control over its territories and populations. The strategic vulnerability of the eastern frontier, where Armenian communities had lived for millennia, became the focal point of a bureaucratic transformation that would reshape the region forever. In January of 1915, the first coordinated actions against the Armenian population began under the explicit guise of wartime security measures. Armenian soldiers serving in the Ottoman military were systematically disarmed and transferred to labor battalions. These men, stripped of their weapons and separated from their units, were assigned to construction and supply operations. Many of these labor battalions would never produce meaningful military output. Instead, they became mechanisms of controlled elimination, with Armenian soldiers transferred to remote locations where they would perish from exposure, malnutrition, and deliberate neglect. The Ottoman Military Command documented these transfers with meticulous precision, creating records that demonstrated the systematic nature of what was occurring. The true catalyst for the escalation arrived on the 24th of April, 1915. In Constantinople itself, Ottoman security forces arrested approximately 250 Armenian intellectuals, community leaders, clergy, and cultural figures. This was not a spontaneous action driven by wartime hysteria. The arrests were coordinated, planned, and executed with bureaucratic precision. Names had been compiled in advance. Addresses were known. The timing was deliberate. These men, who represented the intellectual and spiritual heart of Armenian society, were removed from their homes and offices in the capital city. Most of those arrested would be executed in the following weeks and months, their deaths recorded and filed away in Ottoman administrative records. The date itself would later become the symbolic marker of the genocide's commencement, observed annually by Armenians worldwide as April 24th. The arrest of Constantinople's Armenian leadership sent immediate shockwaves through Armenian communities across the Ottoman Empire, yet simultaneously military developments on the eastern frontier provided Ottoman officials with the justification they required to implement their broader plans. Between April 20th and May 16th, 1915, the Battle of Van erupted as Armenian defenders resisted Ottoman military forces. The strategic situation at Van became the pretext for escalated measures against the Armenian population throughout the empire. Ottoman military commanders characterized Armenian resistance as evidence of broader insurrection and disloyalty. These characterizations, whether factually grounded or deliberately exaggerated, provided the political cover necessary for the next phase of implementation. On May 14, 1915, the Ottoman government enacted the law on deportation through formal imperial decree. This was the crucial moment when mass atrocity transformed into legal procedure. The law granted military authorities, particularly Minister of War Enver Pasha, the power to order the forced deportation of entire populations deemed security threats. The legislation provided a veneer of legality to what would follow. Deportations were not presented as ethnic cleansing or mass killing. They were framed as temporary military relocations of populations living in war zones. The law created administrative mechanisms, established chains of command, and delegated authority to regional governors and military commanders. It transformed genocide from an implicit policy into an explicit legal framework. Between May and June of 1915, mass deportations began across the Ottoman Empire with coordinated intensity. Armenian populations in cities, towns, and villages received deportation orders. Families were given minimal time to prepare. Those who possessed resources attempted to sell property, though Ottoman officials ensured that prices collapsed as desperate sales flooded local markets. Armenians were informed that they would be relocated to the Syrian desert, ostensibly for their own safety and away from the war zone. The Ottoman government presented this as a temporary measure, a wartime necessity. The reality would prove catastrophically different. The deportation routes led southward and eastward from Armenian population centers toward the Syrian desert. These were not routes designed for civilian transport. They were death marches. The distances were immense, the terrain unforgiving, and the conditions deliberately harsh. Deportees were provided with minimal food supplies. Water was scarce along many routes. Ottoman military escorts, rather than protecting the deportees, frequently facilitated their destruction. Contemporary accounts describe massacres occurring at specific locations along the deportation routes, with Ottoman soldiers and local militias executing groups of deportees and leaving their bodies in ravines and along roadsides. The scale of mortality during the deportations was staggering. Scholars estimate that between May and June of 1915 alone, tens of thousands of Armenians perished during forced marches. Around the region of Van specifically, Ottoman forces and allied militias killed approximately 24,000 Armenians in villages surrounding the city over a 3-day period in April of 1915. These killings were not incidental to the deportations. They were integral to the process. The deportation system functioned as a mechanism for mass death, with the journey itself designed to eliminate significant portions of the Armenian population before they could reach any destination. The Ottoman government maintained detailed administrative records throughout this process. Deportation orders were issued through official channels. Regional governors submitted reports on deportation progress. Military commanders documented troop movements and supply allocations. The bureaucratic machinery functioned with remarkable efficiency, creating a paper trail that would later provide historians with extensive documentation of what occurred. This bureaucratic precision was not accidental. It reflected the systematic nature of the operation and the deliberate involvement of Ottoman state institutions at multiple levels. The human cost during this initial phase of deportations and massacres was immense. Entire families were separated, with men often killed separately from women and children. Elderly Armenians, unable to withstand the harsh conditions of the deportation routes, died from exposure and starvation. Children perished from disease and malnutrition. Women faced particular vulnerabilities during the marches, with many subjected to sexual violence and coercion. Orphaned children, separated from their families, attempted to survive in conditions of absolute deprivation. Yet resistance persisted, despite the overwhelming power arrayed against the Armenian population. At Van, Armenian defenders mounted military resistance against Ottoman forces. This resistance, while ultimately unsuccessful against the superior military power of the Ottoman state, demonstrated that Armenians were not passive victims of circumstance. They organized defensive positions, gathered what military supplies they could obtain, and fought to protect their communities. The Battle of Van lasted weeks, with Armenian defenders holding positions against Ottoman military assault. The eventual Ottoman military victory at Van did not come swiftly or without cost to Ottoman forces, though the ultimate consequence was the complete devastation of the Armenian community in the region. Throughout the period from May through June of 1915, international observers began reporting on the deportations and massacres. Diplomatic reports, missionary accounts, and eyewitness testimonies documented what was occurring. Foreign consulates in Ottoman territories transmitted reports to their home governments describing the systematic nature of the killings and the deliberate conditions imposed on deportees. These reports provided external documentation of events as they unfolded, creating a record beyond Ottoman administrative records. The international community, however, remained largely unable or unwilling to intervene. The Ottoman Empire was a belligerent power in an ongoing world war, and diplomatic intervention proved ineffective against a government implementing policies through military authority during wartime. The deportation system revealed the complicity of Ottoman bureaucratic structures at multiple levels. Regional governors, charged with implementing deportation orders, generally complied with central government directives. Local administrators processed deportation documents and organized the logistics of removal. Military units provided the enforcement mechanisms. Police forces assisted in rounding up deportees. This widespread bureaucratic participation meant that the genocide was not the product of a small cabal of extremists acting in secret. Rather, it represented a systematic policy implemented through normal channels of government authority, with participation from numerous officials and military personnel across Ottoman territories. The psychological dimensions of this crisis were profound. Armenians faced the destruction of their entire social world. Communities that had existed for centuries were being dismantled. Cultural institutions were being destroyed. Families were being separated and eliminated. The experience was not merely one of individual suffering, though that was certainly present. It was the systematic destruction of an entire society and its way of life. The trauma inflicted during this period would reverberate through Armenian communities for generations, creating collective memory of catastrophic loss. By the end of June of 1915, the first phase of the deportations and massacres had established the pattern that would continue throughout 1915 and into 1916. The Ottoman government had successfully transformed administrative procedure into an instrument of mass death. The bureaucratic machinery was functioning. The legal frameworks were in place. The military forces were engaged. The regional officials were implementing orders. What had begun as policy in Constantinople had become lived catastrophe across Ottoman territories. The crisis represented a turning point not only for the Armenian population, but for the Ottoman Empire itself. The government had crossed a threshold, implementing policies that revealed the full extent of state power when directed toward the elimination of a population. The machinery of modern bureaucracy, combined with military force and legal authority, had proven capable of organizing mass atrocity on an unprecedented scale. The crisis of 1915 demonstrated that systematic genocide could be accomplished through the normal functioning of state institutions, through the participation of ordinary officials and soldiers following orders, through the transformation of administrative procedure into an instrument of death. As the summer of 1915 progressed, the deportations continued with relentless momentum. The Ottoman government showed no signs of altering its course. The international protests that did emerge proved ineffective against a government implementing its policies through military authority during wartime. The machinery that had been constructed continued to operate, consuming the Armenian population in its systematic process. The turning point had been reached, the crisis was now fully activated, and the full consequences of the bureaucracy of annihilation would continue to unfold across Ottoman territories throughout the remainder of 1915 and into 1916, transforming the Ottoman Empire and leaving a permanent scar upon the historical record. The deportations that began in the spring of 1915 did not conclude with the signing of any treaty or the declaration of any armistice. They persisted, evolved, and transformed across the final years of the Ottoman Empire and beyond, extending their reach and consequences far beyond the initial bureaucratic orders that had set them in motion. By the time the Ottoman military campaigns reached their crescendo in 1916, the administrative machinery that had been so carefully constructed in the offices of Constantinople had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The paper trails that had once seemed so orderly, so justified by wartime necessity, now represented something far more difficult to categorize or comprehend. The forced marches toward the Syrian desert, which had accelerated following the enactment of the law on deportation in May of 1915, transformed the landscape of the Ottoman Empire into a vast corridor of suffering. The military units assigned to oversee these deportations operated under orders that maintained the veneer of legitimate military action while facilitating systematic destruction. Soldiers recorded their observations in reports, noting with bureaucratic precision the conditions of the routes, the numbers of deportees, and the inevitable deaths that accompanied each column. These documents, preserved in Ottoman archives and later examined by historians, reveal the mechanics of a process that had become in effect a slow-motion execution disguised as forced relocation. The Battle of Van, which had erupted in April of 1915, served as the crucial turning point that Ottoman leadership would cite to justify increasingly harsh measures against Armenian populations throughout the empire. During those intense weeks from April 20th through May 16th, Armenian resistance in the Van region had provided the pretext for expanding the scope of deportations beyond the initial targets. The military's response to Armenian resistance was disproportionate and systematic. In the villages surrounding Van alone, Ottoman forces conducted operations that resulted in the deaths of approximately 24,000 Armenian civilians over the course of just 3 days in April of 1915. These killings were not isolated incidents of military excess, but rather coordinated actions that demonstrated the lethal consequences of the deportation policy as it was being implemented on the ground. The machinery that had been activated in 1915 continued to grind forward with relentless consistency. By the summer months of 1915, the deportation columns stretched across hundreds of miles of Ottoman territory. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were forced onto roads with minimal provisions, inadequate supplies, and no realistic destination other than death. The Syrian desert, toward which these columns were ostensibly directed, became the symbol of the process itself, a seemingly endless expanse toward which people were driven, knowing that few would arrive alive. The Ottoman military units assigned to guard these columns maintained strict records of their movements, the numbers of deportees under their supervision, and the circumstances of the deaths that inevitably accompanied the marches. Contemporary observers, including diplomats, missionaries, and neutral observers, documented what they witnessed along these deportation routes. American diplomats stationed throughout the Ottoman Empire filed reports to Washington describing scenes of unimaginable suffering. They witnessed families separated, children abandoned, and the systematic stripping of belongings from deportees. These reports, carefully preserved in diplomatic archives, provide detailed accounts of the human cost of the deportation policy. The diplomats noted that the deportations were not spontaneous violence, but rather organized operations that followed established routes and procedures. Ottoman officials at various levels of the administrative hierarchy coordinated the movements, requisitioned supplies, and issued orders that determined the pace and conditions of the marches. The period from May through June of 1915 represented the peak intensity of the initial deportation campaign. During these months, Armenian populations were removed from their ancestral homelands across the Ottoman Empire in waves. The deportation orders came not from local commanders acting independently, but from the central government in Constantinople. Minister of War Enver Pasha, who held primary authority over the military operations that implemented the deportations, issued directives that shaped the scale and nature of the forced removals. The chain of command that connected Constantinople to the deportation columns ensured that the process maintained consistency with the government's overall strategic objectives. These were not random acts of violence, but rather the systematic implementation of policy through military authority. The consequences of the deportations extended far beyond the immediate deaths that occurred during the marches. The Armenian communities that had existed for centuries throughout Anatolia and the eastern regions of the Ottoman Empire were systematically destroyed. Entire villages were emptied, their populations either killed or deported. The economic and social structures that had sustained Armenian life within the empire were deliberately dismantled, properties were seized, businesses were confiscated, and the material foundations of Armenian society were transferred to Turkish and Kurdish populations or simply destroyed. The deportations, in effect, accomplished what years of political pressure and occasional violence had not achieved: the complete removal of Armenians from vast regions of the Ottoman Empire. The scale of the tragedy became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Scholars examining the available evidence, including Ottoman records, survivor testimonies, and contemporary accounts, have estimated that between 664,000 and 1.5 million Armenians perished during the period of 1915 through 1916. The lower estimates focus primarily on deaths directly resulting from the deportations and associated massacres during the peak period of 1915 and 1916. The higher estimates include subsequent deaths during continued military campaigns and secondary effects of displacement and persecution that extended into the 1920s. The range itself reflects the incomplete nature of Ottoman records and the difficulty of accounting for deaths across such vast geographic areas and extended time frames. What remains certain is that the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire was reduced by a catastrophic margin, and the process that accomplished this reduction was systematic, bureaucratic, and justified by government authority. The war itself continued, and the Ottoman Empire's military situation deteriorated as the conflict progressed. By 1916, the Ottoman military had suffered significant defeats on multiple fronts. Yet the campaign against the Armenian population continued with undiminished intensity. This continuation suggests that the deportation policy had become something more than a wartime security measure. It had evolved into a fundamental component of Ottoman strategy regarding the composition and control of their territorial holdings. The military resources devoted to implementing deportations continued even as the empire faced mounting pressures on its battlefield positions. This allocation of resources reveals the priority that Ottoman leadership assigned to the removal of Armenians from Ottoman territory. The aftermath of the deportations created a profound humanitarian crisis. Armenians who survived the initial marches faced ongoing persecution and displacement. Refugee camps in Syria, Lebanon, and other regions struggled to accommodate the hundreds of thousands of survivors who had reached these territories. International relief organizations, including the American Red Cross and various missionary societies, worked to provide assistance to the survivors, but the scale of need far exceeded available resources. The survivors carried not only physical injuries and trauma, but also the psychological devastation of witnessing the destruction of their communities and the loss of family members. Many survivors spent years in camps, unable to return to their former homes because those homes no longer existed as Armenian settlements. The end of World War I in 1918 did not bring an end to the persecution of Armenians. The Ottoman Empire's defeat and subsequent collapse created a power vacuum in the eastern regions of the former empire. Turkish nationalist forces, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, launched military campaigns between 1920 and 1923 that continued the process of Armenian displacement and elimination. These campaigns targeted Armenian survivors and refugees who had remained in or attempted to return to their ancestral lands. The continuation of violence against Armenians after the formal end of the deportation period demonstrates that the policy had served broader objectives regarding the ethnic composition of territories that would eventually become the Turkish nation-state. The military campaigns of 1920 through 1923 completed the ethnic cleansing process that the deportations had initiated. The international response to the Armenian catastrophe was limited and largely ineffective. The chaos of the war, the preoccupation of major powers with their own conflicts, and the Ottoman Empire's control over its own territory meant that few meaningful interventions occurred while the deportations were taking place. After the war, when the full scope of the tragedy became apparent, various international bodies considered the question of accountability. However, the practical mechanisms for pursuing justice against Ottoman officials proved inadequate. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, included provisions regarding Armenian reparations and recognition of Armenian suffering, but these provisions were largely superseded by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which established the boundaries of the new Turkish nation-state and effectively closed the question of Ottoman responsibility for the Armenian tragedy. The documentation of the deportations and their consequences became a matter of historical significance that extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Historians and researchers have spent decades examining Ottoman records, contemporary accounts, survivor testimonies, and diplomatic documents to reconstruct the process by which the deportation policy was conceived, authorized, and implemented. This scholarly work has established that the deportations were not the result of spontaneous local violence or the uncontrolled actions of individual military units. Rather, they represented a coordinated policy that emerged from the Ottoman government's strategic assessment of Armenian populations within the empire. The available evidence indicates that the deportations were authorized at the highest levels of government and implemented through military chains of command that ensured consistency in approach and execution across different geographic regions. The survivors of the deportations carried their memories and experiences across the decades. They documented their experiences in memoirs, testimonies, and oral histories that preserved the human dimensions of the tragedy. These survivor accounts provide crucial details about the conditions of the deportation marches, the experiences of families separated by violence and displacement, and the long-term consequences of trauma and loss. The survivors' testimonies have become integral to the historical record, offering perspectives that official documents cannot capture. Through these accounts, the abstract statistics of death and displacement become comprehensible as the lived experiences of individuals and families who endured unimaginable suffering. The commemoration of the Armenian tragedy became a central element of Armenian identity and consciousness in the diaspora that resulted from the deportations. On April the 24th, the date marking the arrest of Armenian leaders in Constantinople in 1915, Armenians worldwide gather to remember those who perished in the genocide. This annual commemoration serves as both a memorial to the victims and an affirmation of Armenian survival and continuity. The persistence of this commemorative tradition across generations demonstrates the enduring impact of the deportations on Armenian communities. The tragedy that occurred in 1915 and 1916 continues to shape Armenian consciousness and identity more than a century later. The question of historical acknowledgement and international recognition of the Armenian tragedy has remained contested and politically sensitive. The Turkish government has historically resisted characterizing the deportations as genocide, instead presenting them as regrettable consequences of wartime military operations. This official Turkish position reflects concerns about national honor and legal liability. However, many historians, international human rights organizations, and numerous national governments have formally recognized the deportations as genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Armenian people as a national, ethnic, and religious group. This disagreement about historical characterization reflects broader questions about how societies confront and acknowledge systematic violence perpetrated by predecessor governments. The legacy of the Armenian deportations extends beyond the immediate historical period in which they occurred. The process by which the Ottoman government transformed security concerns into administrative procedures that facilitated mass death established a tragic precedent in 20th century history. The systematic use of bureaucratic mechanisms to organize and implement genocide would be repeated in subsequent atrocities, most notably in Nazi Germany's Holocaust. Historians have identified the Armenian case as a significant precursor to later genocides, in which administrative systems were weaponized to achieve systematic destruction of targeted populations. The Armenian tragedy thus occupies a crucial position in the history of 20th century violence, serving as an early and devastating example of how modern bureaucratic states could organize systematic destruction on an unprecedented scale. The destruction of Armenian communities in the Ottoman Empire resulted in irreplaceable cultural losses. Ancient Armenian churches, monasteries, and cultural sites were destroyed or abandoned. The Armenian diaspora that resulted from the deportations spread Armenian communities across the world, creating a global network of Armenian exiles and their descendants. These diaspora communities worked to preserve Armenian culture, language, and traditions in the absence of a secure homeland. The establishment of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1920 provided a territorial base for some Armenian refugees, though the Soviet context created its own complexities and constraints on Armenian autonomy and cultural expression. The bureaucratic machinery that had been constructed to facilitate the deportations left extensive documentary evidence. Ottoman officials, maintaining their administrative practices even during the implementation of genocidal policy, created records that documented their actions. These records, preserved in Turkish archives and increasingly made available to scholars, provide crucial evidence about the systematic nature of the deportations. The existence of these documents has allowed historians to trace the chain of command, identify the officials responsible for issuing and implementing orders, and understand the mechanisms by which the policy was administered across different regions of the empire. The same bureaucratic systems that had enabled the deportations thus also provided the evidence necessary to establish their systematic and intentional nature. The Armenian deportations represent a tragedy of immense proportions, executed through systems of organization and authority that transformed the machinery of state into an instrument of destruction. The approximately 1 million or more Armenians who died during the period from 1915 through the early 1920s represent one of history's greatest humanitarian catastrophes. The survivors, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, carried the trauma of their experiences into diaspora communities that would preserve Armenian identity and culture across continents and generations. The legacy of the deportations continues to shape historical consciousness, international debates about genocide recognition, and Armenian cultural identity more than a century after the events themselves. The Armenian tragedy stands as a stark testament to the dangers of allowing bureaucratic systems to be subordinated to genocidal intent, and as a sobering reminder of the consequences when organized state violence operates without effective international constraint or accountability. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to explore these incredible stories from the Great War with me. If you enjoyed learning about this pivotal moment in history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing these stories to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of World War I fascinates you most. What would you like to explore next? Trust me, we've got so many more untold stories and hidden histories coming your way. The First World War shaped our modern world, and there's always something new to discover. So stay curious and keep learning. See you next time.